Okay. And let me share my screen. There we go. Okay, so why don't we start this halacha again that we just started yesterday, as far as the quality of the beis din that has to be appointed by the city. He says in Sif Yud Zayin, "V'habeis din sheyamidu tovei ha'ir tzrichim leida bahem sheyesh b'chol echad mehem zayin dvar." Whatever beis din is established by the city council of a community, they have to make sure that they possess the following 7 qualities. And by the way, a lot of this is derived from this week's Parsha, because Yisro gave advice to Moshe that they should choose Anshe Chayil, Anshe Elokim, Anshe Emes Yirei Elokim Sonei Votza, that the people that they are God-fearing people, people of truth, people who hate any kind of corruption or bribery. And so that's part of the 7. So what are the 7? Chachma b'Torah, they have to be Talmidei Chachamim. Number 2, Anava, they have to be modest. Number 3 is Yira, they have to be God-fearing. Number 4, Sinas Mamon Afilu Shalahem, that they have an aversion or really a distaste for material gain, even if it's their own. And that was number 4. And number 5 is Ahavas HaEmes, lovers of truth, and that's where we get from this week's Parsha. Number 6, Avas Habrios Lahem, or Avas Habrios, they love people. In other words, they get along well with people. They have an affinity for people. And number 7, Bale Shem Tov B'Maasehem, that they have a good reputation, that they act favorably. Now, V'chol Hamamid Dayan She'eno Hagun, Harei Zeh She'ha'amidu over below Sasa, that if they appoint someone who's not fit to be a judge, then the person that was appointed is in violation of a mitzvah lo saseh. In other words, the judge himself, by accepting the post when he knows that he's not fit for the job, is in violation of a mitzvah lo saseh. Shenemar lo sakiru fanim b'mishpat. As the pasuk says, do not recognize faces when it comes to judgments. What does that mean? Omar lo takir pnei ha'ish lemor, that you're not allowed to recognize the face of a particular individual to say, Ploni ashirhu o krovi, so-and-so is wealthy, or he's a relative and I owe him a favor, o shivenu badin, let me appoint him as a dayan. Ve'asr lahamid am haaretz al smach sheyishal kol din lechacham. And it is asr to establish one of the dayanim as who is an Am Haaretz. In other words, you might wish to make a legitimate logical argument. The argument would be, let me appoint this person who's not knowledgeable, he's an Am Haaretz, let me appoint him as a Dayan, and he'll ask his Rebbe, he'll ask a rabbi what the correct psak is. That you're also not allowed to do. And the Imrei Yaakov will give us fill in some of the blanks. B'chol dayan shenitmaneh b'shvil kesef v'zahav, and any judge who was appointed not because he's worthy, but rather because he has financial influence, asur la'amod mipanav o lechabdo b'shar kavod. You should never stand up for that person. You should never give that person honor, which is probably going to be a hard thing to do if that person has standing within the community. But basically, he says, don't give honor to someone who doesn't deserve to be in that position of honor. Below od, elishemitzvah lahakelbo ulazalzelbo. He says, but I'll go even further. It's a mitzvah to treat that person with disrespect. Why? Sha'alav darshu chachamim, because about such a person our sages teach, Elohei chesef belohei zahav lo sa'aselach. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gold. Shehem ka'avodah zara shemitzvah l'zalzel ba. Because people who are elevated within the community because of their gold and silver, you are like an idolater if you elevate that person and give them a station that they are not worthy of. It is rather a mitzvah to destroy idolatry, just like it's a mitzvah to destroy the aura of someone who has only been elevated not because of their Torah knowledge, but rather because they've bought their way into the rabbinic aristocracy, shall we say. Okay, now, I don't know of too many cases where that occurs today, where rabbis buy their way in, but it's not unheard of. It's not completely unheard of today, where people are given posts of positions of power, of rabbinic authority, not because they are worthy of it, but rather because of some ulterior motive. Okay, so just wanted to leave that with you. So let's take a look at some of the Imrei, and that, by the way, concludes chapter 9. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. The Habestin Sheya'amidu, that the court that they establish, they have to make sure that each one of the Dayanim has the 7 qualities that we mentioned. Rod Salomar. The Tove Ha'ir or Parnaseim Hamamidim Lahem Beistim Tzrichim Leida V'chule. What we mean to say is that the city council members and whoever is supporting the city council, who are in charge of appointing the Beistim, they need to first verify that the people who are being chosen for this post have the following qualities, etc. Ve'ein elu rishayin lihistalek milihiyos dayanim. And these people have no right lihistalek milihiyot dayanim. I think what he means, yes, what it means is as follows. If a person is fit to fulfill the criteria that are mentioned in this list, he doesn't have a right to not serve. In other words, if you are a person who has wisdom and has integrity and has all of these things that we mentioned, then if you are called upon to serve, you must serve. Unless you know that there's someone else that is more worthy than you. But if the generation requires your knowledge and your expertise, you are obligated to serve. He does point out in the footnote in Kufayin Vav Ve'im Higiu Lahora'a Af Sheyesh Acherim Gedolim Rashai, that once you reach the level of expertise that you're able to paskin halacha, you don't have to. You're not mechuyev. You're not obligated to demur just because you know that there's someone even greater than you. If you are invited to assume a post of rabbinic authority, even if there are others that are more worthy, you're not obligated to say, "Oh no, he's better than me." No, you're permitted to take the post once you know that you're capable of serving and you fit the criteria. And then he also writes in the footnote, "V'chidushay hafla simin ches kasav dahad yamrin the Talmud shegiya l'ra ve'eno more." He says that the Hafla writes that the Talmud says that any student, any Talmud Chacham, who has reached the ability to paskin halacha and refuses to do so, is committing a serious sin. He says that's only when it comes to Isser v'Heter d'chayev min haTorah. That's when it comes to Shailas in Yoredeya. Is it mutter or is it usser? Right? But when it comes to financial law, a person does have a right to recuse himself from adjudication, even when he's worthy for it. He may say, I don't feel comfortable. I need to remain impartial, let's say, on financial matters, because this is going to create too much machlokas within my family or community or whatever it is. A person does have a right to do that. So he just wants to provide that caveat. But under normal circumstances, any person who has reached the qualifications and is called upon to serve, as a general rule, does have a right, does have an obligation to serve. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Anava, he has to be humble. Shiflus v'savlanus, which means both a feeling of self-deprecation and also patience. Those are the two sort of manifestations of humility, where he acts in a lowly behavior, showing self-deprecation, and also he's very patient with others and doesn't express, all right, get on with it already, come on. Okay, which is so hard sometimes, you have to, patience is such a virtue, especially when you already know what the person wants to tell you. But sometimes, when listening to people, it requires patience to let the person express themselves, even though you already know what they want to say. Okay. Sinas mamon afilu shelahen. They have a sort of a sinna. I think hatred is too strong of a word, but he means that they have this negative attitude towards money. Okay, she'enam nivhalim alav v'lo rodfim l'kabetz hamamon. That they don't get frightened when there's a financial problem, and they don't pursue money as to make it their primary goal. Ahavas ha'emes, they love truth. Sheyihi rodfim achar hatzedek machmat atzman b'da'atan. That this quality means that they run after justice, not for any ulterior motive, but because it's the right thing. V'sonim et hachamas, and they despise any kind of perversion of justice, ubarchen mikol mine avel, and run away from any kind of corruption. Dayan she'eno hagun, and he says, and it's usher to establish a judge in a post that is not worthy for the job. Hein shema midayan she'eno hagun b'maisim afshu talmud chacham, o she'eno talmud chacham afshu hagun b'maisim. So this is true, that you may not appoint a judge, someone who to be a judge, regardless of what they're lacking, which means even if they're a brilliant Talmud Chacham, but they are not proper in their behavior, or they're proper in their behavior, but they're an ignoramus. Both are wrong. Both of these people are wrong to appoint as a judge of the community. Afal pishu kulo machmadim. He says, even though the person may be the sweetest of the sweethearts, and he's such a lovely guy, and he has so many other milas, so many other good qualities. He's so sweet when he talks. He's got such a beautiful smile, but there's nothing in between his ears. In other words, he just doesn't have the Torah knowledge. So you can't appoint him, and if you do, you are in violation of the mitzvah lo saseh. Va'asur laha'amid am ha'aretz. You're not allowed to set up an am ha'aretz, even with the assurance that when he doesn't know something, he's going to ask his rebbe. So he says, Va'ayaros she'ein bahem chachamim haru'uyim lios dayanim. What do you do in a city where there aren't Torah scholars present? Like, what do you do in a town where you don't have people who fit the criteria that we've just mentioned? And you need to have judges. This is a very important sif katan. You need to have judges in your community, because otherwise people are going to go to secular court. And the problem is you don't have anyone that fits the bill that we just mentioned. So what should you do? Memanim hatovim v'hachachamim shebahem. So what you do is, the Rama, this is from the Rama and the Shulchan Aruch, you have to take the best that you got, even if they don't fit the entire bill. And even if they're not fit to be judges in another context, but you can only take the best of whom you have. B'keven shekiblu aleim b'nei ha'ir ein acher yachol lefaslan. Once they have been accepted by the city members, the city council, which represents the entire city, no one has a right to disqualify them and argue that they're not the right people. V'chein kol tzibur yicholim lekabel aleihem beis din she'enam ru'uyin min haTorah. And similarly, any Jewish community which arrives at consensus and says, we want this guy, right? Even if does not fit the criteria, they do have that right, as long as it's an entire community that's making the decision. So it's a little surprising because that seems to contradict what we just said, which is that anyone who appoints a judge who's not worthy is in violation of the mitzvahs lo saseh. But I guess you have to say that that's in the context of where there are people who are capable of filling the bill, and they pass that person over and choose somebody who's of lesser quality and is not worthy to fulfill that role. Okay. Next.
Rabbi, can I ask a quick question on that? Sure. Unless a rabbi knows what I'm going to say and doesn't have patience to listen to me, but I don't think that's the
case. Go ahead.
I'm just curious as to, if we said that there's these two tracks of sort of the personality type and the knowledge, that would you try and select the person who has the right personality and lacks knowledge and train them because they say it's harder to change one's personality kind of issues? So would that be the way that they would go? They'd find someone who is a good listener and all those sorts of things and tries to teach them more about the law so that they could fit into that, as opposed to the other way around.
It's a good question, Paul. The Gemara talks about what you're supposed to look for in a teacher when you're looking for a school teacher of children. And the Gemara asks, this is a Gemara in Bava Basra, the Gemara asks, what should you do if you have someone who's really, really smart, but is not good really in explaining things to children, versus you have someone who's really good at explaining things to children, but does not have a lot of knowledge? So which one is preferred? So the Gemara says the latter is preferred. Someone who can explain things well to children and make sure that they understand whatever he's giving over, even if he's not so much of a Talmud Chacham. And the reason is because when it comes to children, you need, the most important part is the communication skill. Because with children, if they misunderstand a principle because they have a Rebbe who's brilliant but doesn't explain things well, they'll get stuck with wrong information for the rest of their life. Because with children, it's like writing something on a tabula rasa, on a blank slate, where everything that's imprinted lasts forever for the rest of their lives. So that's true when it comes to educational issues, which I think almost the way you formulated your question, Paul, you were formulating it more in an educational context, perhaps. But here it's not education. Here it's psak halacha. And so, he doesn't say, like, let's say you have two rabbis, neither of which fits the entire bill. And you're saying, so one of them is a great Talmud Chacham, he's brilliant, but he doesn't have good character. Like he's not very nice to people, he snaps at people and stuff like that. And then you have a fellow who's so sweet and calm and patient, but he's really not so much of a Talmud Chacham. So which one should you choose in that situation? I don't know that we have an answer to this question based on the information in front of us. But I guess the question would be, is that what would be most merutza, what would be most desirable to the community? Clearly, the person who's the greater Talmud Chacham but has poor people interpersonal skills is going to end up making a Chilul Hashem to the public if they perceive that this is a very unpleasant experience going to Beis Din. And I know of certain situations like that where, people get turned off from going to the Beis Din because the Beis Din is so, and it's not because the Beis Din is not an expert Beis Din. They're meticulous and they know exactly what to do. They have a very good reputation, but sometimes the people skills between the rabbi and the litigants is lacking. And he doesn't really explain things nicely, or he becomes impatient and stuff like that, right? And it becomes a serious problem. So there are times when it's good to have, let's say, a secretary of the Beis Din, or a representative of the Beis Din that is sort of the front guy, who may not be one of the dayanim, but is at least an effective communicator and can speak to the litigants and explain to them the process and maybe walk them through it. Okay, so I don't have a really...
No, that's helpful, Rabbi. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Okay, v'chol dayan shenismana b'shvil kesef v'chulei. That any judge who is appointed, not because he's worthy, but rather because he's got influence, financial influence, gold and silver, so then it's like appointing avodah zarah, right? Yesh omrim dim nasan mamon kadeshi yismaneh, that there is an opinion that states that if a person pays his way to become appointed as a judge, afilu hu gadol tfei mishar gedolim b'chachma uveminyan, even if he is smarter than everybody else, and he fits the qualifications better than anyone else, asur la'amod b'fanav, you're still not allowed to stand and show him honor. And I guess the reason is because he bought his way into it, even though he was worthy for it. Now, so that's a really interesting point. I was just about to say, I'm thinking about what goes on in Eretz Yisrael today, that there's a lot of cronyism and nepotism in the Beit Din world. If you're a guy who comes from North America and you spend years in Kollel and you become the most brilliant top-level Talmud Chacham, but you don't have protexia, you don't have a network of cronies that you can count on, there ain't no way that you're ever going to be appointed as a dayan over a community in Eretz Yisrael. I've had friends, my personal friends, who know a lot more than I do because they've spent, I spent 10 years in yeshiva and kollel, of my life. These guys maybe spent twice that amount of time, and they studied Yoredeya, the Iyun, extensively. They still were never able to find a position as a dayan, which is a paid position in Israel, right? To be on an official Beit Din court, which is, I think it's the government paid position. Why? Because they didn't have protexia. They simply didn't have connections. So there's a certain level of corruption inherent within the Beis Din network system in Eretz Yisrael. I say that with no amount of pride. It's just a reality. Everyone is aware of it. And I don't know how to respond to that. So the question would be, well, if the system is already slanted and works against you, could you pay money in that situation? So apparently you're not supposed to do that either. I don't mean to be cynical about it. I just want to present to you that this is the unfortunate reality of the way things work in modern Israel today. So he says that according to one opinion, even if you are the greatest Talmud Chacham available, because you have put in the time, but you don't have the necessary protexia, and so you go ahead and you pay in order to buy your way in, it's still usher, it's what you're doing, and therefore people should not stand up for you. Aval imhu lo natan mamon, ela sheminuhu lefi shuhu gamkein ashir. But let's say you didn't buy your way in, but they appointed you because of your wealth. Because I guess they figured, let's get this guy a good position in our community, and next time we need something fixed, the next time the mikveh needs to be fixed, we'll go to him and say, listen, we gave you such kavod to be our dayan, of course you're going to help us with the mikveh, right? So the question then is that a problem? So he says, Kevin de chacham hu b'chachma satora roi linhog bo kavod. So then in that situation where he didn't buy his way in, but the community appointed him with the confidence that that by putting him in that position, it'll be beneficial for the community, then you are supposed to show that person honor because he is a Talmud Chacham. He does have the qualifications, plus the fact that his wealth is also an asset. There's like this Rabbi Hofstetter, who's a huge Talmud Chacham, spent his whole life starting this organization, Dirshu, but is also a very wealthy person. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have both in one person, and because he's wealthy because of his family, right? So, if that person, let's say, were to be appointed to a station within the community, you should give him kavod because he wasn't appointed in a corrupt fashion, but his wealth, stood well for him in helping him advance within the community. V'yesh omrim, the ileka da'adif minei afilu nosein mamon ba'atzmo shari. There is an opinion, however, that goes even further and says that even if a person bought his way in, but he is the most worthy, and this is from the Chassam Sofer, then it is permitted. In other words, in the example that I gave you about my friend who spent 20 years in Kollel, right, and still couldn't get a position as a Dayan in Eretz Yisrael, if he were to bribe his way in to get a position, because he knows that he is worthy of doing this job better than anybody else, or at least as good as anybody else, so then it's okay to show him honor. Amna muvan lakol shem anshe hakihila lo yitnu eineim b'mamon b'vada yasigu tamid adif minei dahai nosein hakesa. However, the Avnei Nezer says, but it would be much better for the city council to not be looking to take bribes. In other words, the city council should be people of virtue as well. And they themselves should recognize that we're not in this for the money. We're not in this to get paid so that we can either line our pockets or the pockets of the community chest. We have to choose the best dayan regardless of his financial status. And that would be the best way to do it. V'ayin sham be'inyan ha'takana v'hacherim odot inyan zeh sha'asu gedola Yisrael v'chasmu al zeh kemasayim v'chamishim rabbanim v'ayin kan belikutim. And he says, I refer you, he says, to this tshuva of the Avnei Nezer who lived at the end of the 19th century. Apparently, there was some kind of takana that the rabbis of the time made with 250 rabbinic signatories on this letter, basically saying that it was wrong to do any kind of financial dealings in order for a person to be appointed as a community judge. Okay, and we'll take a look at the Likutim here. He says, he quotes the same tshuva of the Avnei Nezer, who says, that 250 rabbis signed on the following document. That no person should serve as a rav of a community or as a dayan based on what he pays, if he pays his way into the position. Whether it's through his own money or through others' money. And that's true even if, let's say, a relative of his has got a rich uncle or a rich family, and they make a donation, right? Donation in question, in quote marks, to the institution, and say that this is not contingent upon you taking our nephew as your next rabbi, but we wanted to give you a donation while you formed the search committee, right? That's hein lekupa sakol afilu devar mitzvah yoser gedola. And even if they donate, let's say, to a community need that is extremely important, kagon binyan beis hakneses u beis hamedrash o mikveh tahara, such as paying for the construction of a new synagogue or a new beis medrash or to beautify the mikveh, right? He says anything that's done with that, with that in tandem with their family member being a candidate, all of that is usher. You have to be very, very careful. So even though the guy is qualified, right? But any association with monetary gain for the institution by taking this person is considered to be a violation of this takana. And this is where we'll hold it for today. We'll finish up the simon next week. Mirz Hashem. We'll only have 2 days of learning next week, Monday and Tuesday. And then I'm going to go away for a couple of weeks. So Mirz Hashem, we'll see you soon. Have a